If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke chapter 7. This is where we're going to be spending, Luke chapter 22, verse 7.
Did we loop around?
Nah, well, we might have. Luke chapter 22. I'm looking at a number here and it hit my brain and that was it. Luke chapter 22. This particular text today is one that honestly, a lot of these texts are like this. We don't capture at all just how significant these texts are in terms of what's going on in the Jewish life. And this one particularly. This is one that is so counterintuitive, so countercultural to everything these Jewish boys understand that we're just not able to capture it. And that's kind of a shame, but I assure you this is something that's happening here at this moment in this text that has never happened in the world, ever, on this planet. So let's take a look at this text and see what it would say to us today. I'll begin reading in verse 7. Then the day of the feast of unleavened bread came, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us to eat." They said to Jesus, "Where do you want us to prepare it?" Jesus said, "Listen, when you've entered the city, there'll be a man carrying a jar of water who will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters and tell the owner of the house, 'Teacher has said to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' The man will show you a large furnished room upstairs and make preparations for our Passover there." So they went and they found things just as Jesus had told them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus took his place at the head of the table, and the apostles joined him. And he said to them, "I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I'll not eat it again until all is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Jesus took the cup, and after giving thanks, he said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." Then he took the bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to each one of them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way he took the cup after they had eaten and said, "This cup that is poured out for you is the covenant of the new covenant in my blood." Now, this entire episode is completely different than everything these Jewish boys know. This has never happened on earth before this moment. Nowhere on this planet has this event occurred this way. Now, some commentators look at this and they say, well, this is Jesus had gone ahead of everybody and prepared everything. I don't think so. I think this was all supernaturally orchestrated. The reason I say that is there's a clue in the text. Jesus said when you go into the town, he sent Peter and John in to make preparations. He said you'll see a guy carrying a jar of water. Jewish men didn't carry jars of water, ever. Women carried jars of water. If you saw a man carrying any kind of liquid, it would be in a wineskin or a water skin, and that meant he was headed out for a journey. But to see a man carrying a water jar, every Jewish woman of a household went out every day, went to wherever the local well was, filled her water jar and brought it home so they had water in the house for that day. Might do it multiple times a day, but it was never a man. That was not a man's job. So that's supernatural as far as I'm concerned, that there would be this man, you'd go there, you'd see him, there he is carrying the water jar. Jesus has made this arrangement maybe, but there are supernatural things taking place. Judas is there. He's not yet carried out his plot. The upper room, this orchestration of Jesus to have this upper room is nothing unusual. Any time on Passover, there would be rabbis traveling from all over that could get there into Jerusalem, and it was an obligation of a Jewish household that you were to allow a rabbi, if they needed a room in your home, to have it. And that they would bring their disciples there and conference with them, and of course on Passover, share the Passover meal. And this was expected. So this was nothing unusual. This was very typical. And at Passover, there'd be hundreds of rabbis in the city doing this exact thing. They had traveled from other places. The city would be very different for them on Passover. It would be full of vendors. There'd be people cooking food out of doors. It would smell good. I mean, it would be like walking into the some kind of Middle Eastern bazaar, a marketplace where all kinds of things were being sold. You could buy sacrificial animals, you could buy food, you could buy all kinds of little things that you might bring with you. It would be clogged with people, and at every gate in the city there would be beggars. Because this is the time of the year, man, when if you're a beggar, you got it going. There are plenty of people who come into the city, and you had some advantages there. The people were coming into the city for a very specific religious observance, which made them generous. I mean, we do it here. Salvation Army sets up their bucket out in front of stores at Christmas time and rings the bell because they know that people just feel more generous at that time of the year. And so Salvation Army says that period of time is when they get the bulk of their donations for the year. So same thing here, the beggars are waiting. The sacrificial event, the day, was extremely ordered. You had to make all your preparations by noon. No more work after noon. And so Peter and John are in the city in the morning. This is happening in the morning. They're getting all these things ready. At noon, you had to be done with it all. At 3 p.m., the ritual sacrifices began. And the way this worked was there were 24 divisions of priests. There'd be hundreds of priests. And the reason for that is you had as many as 250,000 people bringing a lamb there to be sacrificed. So it took a long time. For 3 hours, all they did was sacrifice lambs constantly. It was just a complete... And what happened was Peter and John would have done this. They would have come to the temple. They would have brought the lamb that they had gotten. They would bring it to the priest. One of them had to cut the lamb's throat. You sacrificed your own lamb. The priest held a laver in front of the lamb. The blood was drained. The priest took it over, splashed it on the foot of the altar, and you got out of line. The next person came. This was just a machine going all day long. Jewish sources record that the blood would just pour down the altar on Passover. It was just pouring down because they were sacrificing lambs constantly. 24 divisions of priests. It took all of them to get this done. The lamb would then be handed back to the supplicant, the person who's there to sacrifice. So Peter or John, whichever one of them held the lamb, would have put it over their shoulder and left with it with the skin on. In the evening, they would then roast this lamb. You had to roast it over a pomegranate spit. You had to get pomegranate branches and make a spit and roast the lamb over the spit. Everybody would be dressed in white at the table, in your white robes. And the head of the house, and this had to, it's 6 o'clock, that's when the feast started. That's when you started the meal. The head of the house would be seated at the head of the table. Now, this is not like Da Vinci's painting at all. That's a European rendering of what was going on. In the Middle East, the table was about this tall. It was a square table in the middle of the room, and everybody got down on one elbow, on their left elbow. Always your left, because you never eat with your left hand. Your left hand was the hand for hygiene. So you did not eat with your left hand. If you go to the Middle East today, do not shake hands with anybody and use the left hand. They will not shake your hand because traditionally the left hand is for hygiene. The right hand is what you do everything with. They would recline on an elbow and their legs went out this way. That's why when you see the text where Jesus and the woman, he's in the house of the Pharisee, and the woman, the prostitute, comes in and wipes her hair over Jesus' feet to wipe her tears off his feet. His feet are laying out on the floor. That's why that can happen. He's not sitting in a chair with her crawling around under the table. That's the picture. So each thing in this moment had a ceremonial meaning. There was nothing in this event that didn't mean something to them. The way they were seated meant something. The white robes meant something. The seating meant that we're no longer slaves. That's what it means, because a slave could not recline, ever. The slaves would be standing waiting to serve. And so they would recline, which meant we're no longer slaves in Egypt. That's what it meant. They would have condiments on the table. Peppers, cumin, thyme, various what they called bitter herbs. The bitter herbs were there to remind them of the bitterness of being slaves in Egypt. They had stewed fruit a bowl of stewed fruit. That was to remind them of having to mix straw and clay together to make bricks. They had the roasted lamb, the lamb's blood on the lintel that the angel of death would pass over the home on that night before they left Egypt. And then the roasted lamb meant something. It was a good thing to eat, but it was something that reminded them that they were to eat that lamb on the Passover night because the next day they had to travel. They had to leave. So everything means something here. The celebration would go to about 9 o'clock or 10, just depending on how it went, how many people you had. You had to have at least 10. In any gathering to celebrate a Passover, there had to be 10 people as a minimum. Or you couldn't do it. You had to go join another group. You could not have your own Passover without 10 people. And they would leave. Some of them would leave the homes and go out into the streets because Jerusalem is still wide awake here on Passover. And there would be all kinds of things going on. You could go out into the street and hang around, do things, eat meals, talk with people, and then at 12 midnight, the temple would open. And you could go to the temple and you could pray. Now, the reason that this happens in the way that it does, Peter and John are sent. I've always wondered, why didn't Jesus just go? I mean, he's the rabbi. Why doesn't he go and prepare the Passover? The reason is because he doesn't want to be in Jerusalem during the beginning of the day because he knows that he's going to be arrested. And so to go into Jerusalem in broad daylight would be very risky for him. So he sends Peter and John to take care of it. And the room is all set up and everything happens as we see it listed in the text. But this is where things become very, very, very different. First of all, you see something in Jesus here, a tenderness, a very human tenderness, where he says, how I've longed to eat this Passover meal with you. He knows it's his last one. He's not going to do this again on this earth. And the Passover gets completely reconfigured right from the beginning. He redefines all the elements for them. The unleavened bread, the cup, everything gets redefined. For instance, they pass a cup. In the text, it says Jesus gave them the cup, and they passed it, shared it. That didn't happen at Passover. You had your cup, and you drank your cup. The cup really didn't mean anything. It was your drink. But in this instance, Jesus passes this cup among them and says, this is the cup of the covenant, the new covenant in my blood. Very, very different. The unleavened bread it had meaning. In the Passover feast, what it meant was we had to leave so fast that we didn't have time to leaven the bread. We had to leave the leaven behind and take unleavened bread with us as we traveled. But in this case, Jesus breaks the bread and says, this is my body broken for you. Now, just stop and think for a minute. He's reflecting on what he's going to have to endure. But just to give you a perspective here, stop and think. We're not going to share communion today, but what if we were? And what if I got up here and I took the bread out on the little tray and I said, this is the bread representing my body broken for you. Rib. And here's the covenant in my blood. Rib. That's what this was like for these boys that night. You know, even though they've traveled with Jesus and they've seen lots of things, they've been sort of prepared, they're not prepared for this. One of the surest evidences of Christianity as a historical moment in that period of time, at that place, that this all happened in history is the fact of the change of the Passover. That is this is absolutely something that has happened only once on this planet here. Never before had this happened like this, ever. And these Jewish boys just didn't have any sense of where to plug this in. We do because we're so used to it, but for them, no, this was very, very radical for them. It represents, of course, a new covenant. Now, what does that mean? I mean, these disciples, they didn't have any. Jesus says these words. Here it is recorded, and Luke records it this way: the covenant, the new covenant in my blood. They don't have any idea what he's talking about. They know of the covenant. They've been raised to know of the covenant that was made between God and the Jews. The new covenant, what is that? We don't even understand what you're talking about. But this contrast with the old is really powerful. Jesus, when he does this, he's not really explaining any of this to them. He's preparing them for something that's coming. They don't have a clue what's coming. The symbolism of blood was terrible. And it was terrible for the Jews, as terrible as it is for us. Just think, imagine yourself, you've got this little lamb, innocent little creature. You carry it up there, you're in charge. You're the one who's going to sacrifice for your 10 or 12 or whatever it is people. You take the little lamb up there, you walk up to the priest puts his hand on the lamb, and you slit its throat. And the blood drains out, the priest slings the blood onto the altar, and you walk away. And there's blood just pouring all over the place. Why is that done that way? It's to show us just how terrible sin compared to who God really is. That's why it's done. It's to show us the terrible nature of sin. Look, I'm a 21st century person. I can't relate to that. I really cannot. I wish I could. I wish I could see it the way the Jews saw it at that day. I remember I was taken once. You have to remember, at this moment, these Jewish boys have been celebrating this way for 1,500 years. 1,500 years. Now, we don't have anything like that for we who are Americans, do we? Everything here is 250 years old. And as far as we're concerned in this room, our lifetime is history. The rest of it's something we read about in a book. We can't relate to it. They had known nothing but the Passover for 1,500 years when this happens. And Jesus says, the blood doesn't mean what it used to mean. The bread doesn't mean what it used to mean. This change and the gross nature of the blood and everything about it does remain. And it's there to teach you and me. We see this tenderness in Jesus, but also this incredible moment where Jesus unmakes everything these Jewish boys know. This new covenant is an inward covenant. The old covenant was all outward. Everything was done outside. You had the Decalogue on the stone tablets. You had the altar. You had the laver. You had the lamb. You had the blood. And every day the priests sacrificed lambs for the sins of the people every day. And on this day they sacrificed about 250,000 of them all at once. Because everything's done outside. Everything's done outside. But now the new covenant comes. These boys don't understand. What is Jesus talking about? The covenant, new covenant in my blood? What does that even mean? We have the glorified hindsight of a Bible and our whole lifetimes of understanding what it means. They didn't have any of that. What they know is the external, the old covenant. You know, we have it in our country right now, just to give you perspective. In our country, we have the legal code in Washington that establishes the legal code for all 50 states is about 20,000 pages. The tax code is 2,000. Why is that? Because that external thing keeps us from eating each other up. That's the way the old covenant worked. It was just there. You knew it was there. God has promised. We're the Jews. He's promised with us. We understand that. We're to sacrifice these lambs and go through all these rituals in order to remove sin, but it doesn't take the sin away because it doesn't change the person. The person comes and sacrifices the lamb and goes home, and they are the same. Nothing has changed internally. That's the distinction. The new covenant is internal. It's where we get changed. You see Jesus here in his humanness being so tender with the disciples. How long I've wished to eat this Passover meal with you. He says the same thing to us. The same thing. He wants to spend our lives with us. How long I've wanted to spend your life with you. He says to all of us. Priest stands in day after day, the letter to the Hebrews says, serving and offering the same sacrifices again and again, sacrifices that can never take away sin. Jesus makes the sacrifice, the same letter to the Hebrews says, once and for all, to take away the sins of the world. The question for us is, as we leave here today, are our lives something that we would want to share with Jesus or not? I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with